World War I began on July 28, 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This seemingly small conflict between two countries spread rapidly. Soon, Germany, Russia, Great Britain, and France were all drawn into the war, largely because they were involved in treaties that obligated them to defend certain other nations. Western and Eastern fronts quickly opened along the borders of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The fighting between countries' exhausted, demoralized troops continued to plod along until the Germans lost a number of individual battles and very gradually began to fall back. A deadly outbreak of influenza, meanwhile, took heavy tolls on soldiers of both sides. Eventually, the governments of both Germany and Austria-Hungary began to lose control as both countries experienced multiple mutinies from within their military structures. The war ended in the late fall of 1918 after the member countries of the Central Powers signed armistice agreements one by one. Germany was the last, signing its armistice on November 11, 1918. As a result of these agreements, Austria-Hungary was broken up into several smaller countries. Germany, under the Treaty of Versailles, was severely punished with hefty economic reparations, territorial losses, and strict limits on its rights to develop militarily. Many historians in hindsight believe that the Allies were excessive in their punishment of Germany and that the harsh Treaty of Versailles actually planted the seeds of World War II rather than foster peace. The treaty's declaration that Germany was entirely to blame for the war was a blatant untruth that humiliated the German people. Furthermore, the treaty imposed steep war reparation payments on Germany, meant to force the country to bear the financial burden of the war. Although Germany ended up paying only a small percentage of the reparations it was supposed to make, it was already stretched financially thin by the war, and an additional economic burden caused enormous resentment. Ultimately, extremist groups such as the Nazi Party were able to exploit this humiliation and resentment and take political control of the country in the decades following. The Progressive Era lasted from 1895 until World War I. This was a period of unrest and reform. Monopolies continued in spite of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and social problems flourished in the U.S. During the 1910s, labor unions continued to grow as the middle classes became more and more unhappy. Unsafe working conditions were underscored by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, in which 145 female workers were killed. Women were also striving for equality. The first suffrage parade was held in 1910, and the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1919 after World War I ended. The social trauma caused by unprecedented rates of casualties manifested itself in different ways, which have been the subject of subsequent historical debate. Some people were revolted by nationalism and its results, and began to work towards a more internationalist world, supporting organizations such as the League of Nations. Pacifism became increasingly popular. Others had the opposite reaction, feeling that only the strength and military might could be relied upon in a chaotic and inhumane world. Anti-modernist views were an outgrowth of the many changes taking place in society. U.S. intervention in the war, as well as the Wilson administration itself, became deeply unpopular.
Giacomo Paolo Giovanni Battista della Celsa was born November 21st, 1954, and died January 22nd, 1922, at the age of 67. He was ordained December 21st, 1878, and was consecrated December 22nd, 1907, by Pope Pius X. He was created cardinal May 25th, 1914. Pope Benedict XV's papacy began September 3, 1914, and ended January 22, 1922. His predecessor was Pope Pius X, and his successor was Pope Pius XI. Pope Benedict issued in 1917 the first ever Code of Canon Law of the Roman Catholic Church, the creation of which he had prepared with Pietro Gaspari and Eugenio Pacelli during the pontificate of Pope Pius X. The Code of Canon Law is considered to have stimulated religious life and activities throughout the Church. He named Pietro Gaspari to be his Cardinal Secretary of State and personally consecrated Nuncio Eugenio Pacelli on May 13, 1917 as Archbishop on the very day of the first Marine apparition in Fatima. World War I caused great damage to Catholic missions throughout the world. Benedict revitalized these activities, asking in maximum illud for Catholics throughout the world to participate. Between 1846 and 1903, the Church experienced its two longest pontificates in history up to that point. Together, Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII ruled for 57 years. In 1914, the Cardinals chose Delia Chelsea at the age of 59, indicating their desire for another long-lasting pontificate at the outbreak of World War I, which he labeled the suicide of civilized Europe. The war and its consequences were the main focus of Pope Benedict XV. He declared the neutrality of the Holy See and attempted, from that perspective, to mediate peace in 1916 and 1917.
On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Wilson cited Germany's violation of its pledge to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and its attempts to entice Mexico into an alliance against the United States as his reasons for declaring war. On April 4, 1917, the U.S. Senate voted in support of the measure to declare war on Germany. The House concurred 2 days later. The United States later declared war on the Austria-Hungarian Empire on December 7, 1917. Following the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the German army opened the Western Front by first invading Luxembourg and Belgium, then gaining military control of important industrial regions in France. The tide of the advance was dramatically halted at the Battle of the Marne. Both sides dug in along a meandering line of fortified trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier with France. This line remained essentially unchanged for most of the war. Although German advance was halted, they had overrun most of Belgium, which remained in German control for most of the war. German authorities governed harshly. The repressive measures executed by the German authorities were used effectively by the British to sway public opinion in the U.S. and help persuade the Americans to enter the war. In 1918, after the failed German offensive, Allied armies broke through the German front lines, liberating large areas of Belgium. This defeat forced the Germans to agree to an armistice decided on November 11, 1918. The Germans withdrew from Belgium, the Flemish government collapsed, and King Albert returned as the Belgian government was restored. Here are some examples of music during World War I. Songs were written to either support the war or oppose it. At the outbreak of the war, many songs were produced which called for young men to join up. This first song, called We Don't Want to Lose You, But We Think You Ought to Go, expresses enthusiasm for the war.
And no matter what befalls you, we shall love you all the more. So come and join the forces as your fathers did before. Oh, we don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go. For your king and your country both need you so.
It was almost impossible to sing anti-war songs on the music hall stage. The managers of music halls would be worried about their license, and the sing-along nature of music hall songs meant that one needed to sing songs which had the support of the vast majority of the audience. In the music hall, dissent about the war drive was therefore limited to sarcastic songs, such as this next song called Oh, It's a Lovely War.
Wouldn't join the army. army? That's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. To be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Here's a short film covering propaganda during World War I.
To stiffen the will to win, mass propaganda was used for the first time.
This propaganda they told us about them killing women and children and one thing and another. They had a lot of propaganda about that there. The Hun, you know, they called him. And how he'd go through these villages when he'd capture them and kill all the people off and that there. That's the stuff that they told us. To feed you up to get you mad, I guess.
Atrocities alleged to have been committed by the Germans in Belgium were presented in melodramatic form.
Wir waren wütend über diese Diffamierung.
We were furious about this slander.
Haben sie immer als bösartige.
We always said that it was evil propaganda, and we felt that we Germans were powerless to answer back.
During World War I, fashion became more styled after military clothing. Men wore trench coats and less luxurious clothing and accessories. For women, due to the fact that women took on more physical jobs during the war as the men were off fighting, they needed clothes that allowed them to move more freely. A military look crept into women's fashion. Women started to wear military-inspired clothes, tunics, jackets, and belts. There was often a lack of color in jewelry. During World War I, one of the most famous pieces of clothing to come out of it was the trench coat. It was first used by farmers and then by the military. World War I was also the birth of the modern fashion show. Before the war, designers worked individually with clients, creating personalized looks. But during the war, less people could afford a personal style, so they created fashion shows in order to exhibit their creations to a mass audience. In the US during World War I, education was altered through curriculum changes with government pamphlets and required patriotism sessions. There was a strong focus on nationalism and patriotism. The government funded propaganda to promote nationalism and anti-German sentiment. Kids were encouraged to join ROTC organizations and to buy war bonds to support the government. There was also a movement from state education system towards a united educational system to create a national standard. Textbooks were even changed to portray the American Revolution in a way that Great Britain wasn't the bad guys because of our alliance with Britain during the war.
World War I tilted culture on its axis, particularly in Europe and the United States. And evidence of this change still shows today in film, visual arts, music, television shows, etc. Thanks to modernism, World War I was one of the biggest culture wars the world has ever seen. During and after World War I, flowery Victorian language was blown apart and replaced by more sinewy, R-rated prose styles. In visual art, surrealists and expressionists devised wobbly, chopped-up perspectives and nightmarish visions of fractured human bodies and splintered societies slouching toward moral chaos. Throughout Western art, the grim realities of industrial warfare led to a backlash against the propaganda and nationalism that sparked the war. Cynicism towards the ruling classes and disgust with war planners and profiteers led to demands for art forms that were more honest and direct, less decorated with rhetoric and euphemism. At the start of the war, British soldiers at the front were allowed 10 ounces of meat and 8 ounces of vegetable per day, a luxury compared to what would be provided in the years to come. Parcels from home loaded with chocolate, tins of sardines, and sweet biscuits would be a welcome but irregular source of extra nourishment. For day-to-day meals, soldiers' options were limited. The size of the British Army and the efficiency of the German submarine blockade grew in tandem, with doubly bad results for the state of the British Army rations. By 1916, the meat ration was down to 6 ounces a day, and later, meat was only provided once every 9 days. Things were getting worse, and Tommies were beginning to fend for themselves. The winter of 1916 saw a major shortage of flour. It was replaced by dried, ground-up turnips, which produced unappetizing, diarrhea-inducing bread. At this time, the staple food of the British soldier was pea soup with horse meat chunks. The hard-working kitchen teams were having to source local vegetables as best as they could, and when that was not an option, weeds, nettles, and leaves would be used to whip up soups and stews. Each battalion was assigned 2 industrial-sized vats for food preparation. The problem was that every type of meal was ready within these containers, and so, over time, everything started to taste the same. As a result, pea and horse-flavored tea was something that the soldiers had to get used to. One widely and equally widely disliked ration was the canned soup makanachi. A thin, watery broth containing sliced turnips and carrots, makanachi was tolerated by famished soldiers and detested by all. Of course, to allow the Germans to get wind of this desperate food situation would never do. The British Army had to be portrayed as a content, well-fed, determined body whose morale was unwavering. An army announcement that British soldiers were being given 2 hot meals a day, however, caused widespread outrage among soldiers. The army subsequently received over 200,000 angry letters demanding that the dire truth be made.
How would I change history? After World War I, Germany was put in a position that it would never be able to completely pay for the damage they caused during the war. Due to this, Hitler led Germany out of their depression by using the Jewish nationality as a scapegoat for his own benefit. To avoid the Holocaust, it would be a simple matter of decreasing the taxes and reparations that Germany would have to pay in order to avoid World War II. The problem is that there were many more variables that went into World War II and the Holocaust, and if they were able to be calculated, then they could be avoided as well.